What happens when a woman's world shatters at 30,000 feet, only to discover she holds all the power? When my husband handed me divorce papers at the airport gate, smiling with his mistress by his side, he thought he'd won. He thought he'd broken me. But what he didn't know was that fate had given me the ultimate weapon, and by the time our plane landed, his perfect escape would become his worst nightmare. This is the story of how I turned my deepest betrayal into the most satisfying revenge, and how sometimes, the universe conspires to help those who've been wronged. If you love stories of justice, shocking twists, and women who rise from the ashes stronger than ever, subscribe to this channel because what happens next will leave you speechless. Part 1: The Betrayal. The fluorescent lights of JFK International Airport buzzed overhead as I stood frozen in Terminal 4, staring at the manila envelope my husband Marcus had just thrust into my trembling hands, my entire world collapsing in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Sign them, Elena," he said with a coldness I'd never heard in his voice during our 7 years of marriage, 7 years of what I'd foolishly believed was love, partnership, and unwavering devotion. Behind him, draped on his arm like an expensive accessory, stood Vivian Chan, my former college roommate, my maid of honor, the woman I'd trusted with my deepest secrets and darkest fears, now transformed into the architect of my destruction. Her perfectly manicured hand resting possessively on Marcus's chest, her diamond engagement ring catching the harsh airport lighting and sending fractured rainbows across the polished floor. The divorce papers felt impossibly heavy in my hands, each page a betrayal, each clause a knife twisting deeper into my already hemorrhaging heart, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process how the man who'd whispered promises of forever into my hair just last week was now looking at me with something between pity and impatience, as if I were merely an obstacle standing between him and his shining new future. "We have a flight to catch," Vivian purred, her voice dripping with false sympathy that made my stomach churn with nausea so violent I thought I might vomit right there on the gleaming airport tiles. "Marcus and I are heading to the Maldives for 2 weeks. Our honeymoon really, though of course we can't make it official until you sign those papers like a good girl." The casual cruelty of her words, the way she emphasized "good girl," as if I were a pet being trained, sent a surge of rage through my veins so powerful it momentarily overwhelmed the crushing grief that had been suffocating me since Marcus had approached me at the departure gate 20 minutes ago. I looked down at the papers again, my vision blurring with unshed tears I refused to let fall. Not here, not in front of them. Not when they so clearly expected me to crumble and weep and beg. The settlement terms were laughable, insulting. Marcus was offering me $50,000 and my personal belongings in exchange for our brownstone in Brooklyn, his tech company that I'd helped build with my inheritance, and 7 years of my life I could never reclaim. "You can't be serious," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the constant announcements echoing through the terminal, the rolling of luggage, the chatter of travelers excitedly heading toward their destinations, while my entire world disintegrated. Marcus sighed, running his hand through his dark hair in that familiar gesture that used to make my heart flutter but now only sparked fury, and said, "Elena, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're a smart woman. You know our marriage has been dead for years. I'm giving you a clean break, a chance to start over without dragging this through the courts." His audacity was breathtaking, the way he rewrote our history so casually, erasing the passionate nights and lazy Sunday mornings, the dreams we'd built together, the way he'd held me when my mother died last year, whispering that we'd always have each other. Vivian checked her Apple Watch with exaggerated impatience, her glossy lips pursed in annoyance, and said, "Our flight boards in 40 minutes, Marcus. Maybe we should just go and let her process this in her own time?" But there was something in her eyes, a flash of anxiety that didn't match her confident tone, and in that moment some instinct I didn't fully understand told me to pay attention, to look closer, to see what they weren't saying. I glanced at their boarding passes, casually held in Marcus's free hand, and saw Belize City printed in bold letters, not the Maldives, and the discrepancy felt significant though I couldn't yet understand why. "Just sign the papers, Elena," Marcus pressed. And now there was definitely urgency in his voice, a tension in his jaw that suggested this wasn't just about convenience or impatience. "I've already had my lawyers file the preliminary documents. This is just a formality." Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and the investigative journalist in me, the career I'd abandoned to support Marcus's startup dreams, suddenly awakened after years of dormancy. my instincts screaming that this public airport confrontation, the rushed timeline, the obvious lies about their destination, all pointed to something much bigger than a simple affair. I pulled out my phone, pretending to review the document, but instead quickly texting my brother David, who worked in financial fraud investigation for the FBI. Need deep background check on Marcus immediately. Think he's fleeing country. Will explain later. The message sent just as Marcus reached for my phone, but I pulled it away, clutching it to my chest and said with a calmness I didn't feel, I need to read through this properly. Meet me at the Starbucks in 30 minutes and I'll give you my answer. Vivian's face flushed with anger, her composure cracking, and she snapped, We don't have 30 minutes. Tell her, Marcus. Tell her we need to leave now. The desperation in her voice confirmed my suspicions. They weren't just running away together. They were running from something, and whatever it was big enough to make them reckless, sloppy, desperate enough to hand me divorce papers in a public airport instead of through proper legal channels. Marcus grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to bruise, and the man I'd loved for 7 years had never, ever touched me with violence, which meant he was cornered, frightened, and therefore dangerous. Sign the fucking papers, Elena, he growled, all pretense of civility abandoned, his handsome face twisted into something ugly and unfamiliar. I wrenched my arm away, stumbling backward, and several nearby travelers turned to look, their expressions concerned, and I realized with a strange sort of clarity that I had an audience, witnesses, people who would remember seeing a man intimidate his wife at an airport gate. My phone buzzed, David responding with shocking speed. Wire transfer of $4.7 million from your joint account to offshore Cayman account 3 days ago. Marcus under investigation for securities fraud. Federal warrant being issued within 24 hours. Stall him. AM sending agents to JFK now. My hands shook as I read the message once, twice, 3 times, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of Marcus's betrayal, because it wasn't just our marriage he'd destroyed, it wasn't just my heart he'd shattered. He'd stolen my inheritance, my mother's life insurance, everything she'd left me, and he'd used our marriage, our joint accounts, our intertwined lives, to commit crimes that would apparently send him to federal prison. And Vivian, my former best friend, was clearly his accomplice, which meant she'd been playing me for years, probably sleeping with Marcus since before our wedding, whispering plans to rob me blind while braiding my hair and helping me choose bridesmaid dresses. The grief that had been suffocating me transformed into something else, something harder and sharper, a rage so pure it felt almost transcendent, and I looked up at Marcus and Vivian with new eyes, seeing clearly for the first time in years. Okay, I said softly, my voice steady now, calm, even gentle. I'll sign. The relief on their faces would have been comical if the situation weren't so devastating, and Marcus actually smiled, the charming smile that had first made me fall in love with him at a Columbia University mixer 9 years ago, back when I still believed in fairy tales and happily ever afters. Thank you, Elena, he said, pulling a pen from his jacket pocket with the eagerness of a man who could already taste his freedom. You're doing the right thing. I took the pen, clicked it open, and then, as if it had slipped from my fingers accidentally, dropped it, watching it roll under a nearby row of seats, and said, Oh God, I'm so clumsy. Let me just. I bent down to retrieve it, taking my time, my mind racing through possibilities and strategies, thinking about how to keep them here until David's FBI agents arrived, how to make sure they didn't board that flight to Belize where they'd disappear into a non-extradition country with my money and their freedom. When I straightened up, I saw airport security approaching from the corner of my eye. 2 officers, not FBI, just regular TSA, but they were heading in our direction, and with them was an older woman in a Delta Airlines uniform. Her face creased with concern. Excuse me, the Delta employee said, addressing Marcus directly. We've had a report of a disturbance at this gate. Is everything all right here? Vivian immediately plastered on her most charming smile, the one she used to use to talk our way into exclusive parties and sold-out concerts, and said, Everything's fine, officer. Just some last-minute travel stress, you know how it is. But one of the TSA officers, at my arm where Marcus had grabbed me, where I could already feel the bruises forming under my sleeve, and his expression hardened. Ma'am, he addressed me directly, are you traveling with these individuals? Are you being coerced in any way? And in that moment I had a choice. I could protect Marcus one last time, Smooth everything over. Let him board that plane and disappear from my life forever, taking my money but leaving me my freedom, or I could tell the truth. Set in motion a chain of events that would destroy him completely, and possibly destroy me in the process because our finances were so entangled that his crimes would inevitably splash back on me. I thought about my mother, who'd worked 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school, who taught me that integrity mattered more than convenience, who died believing I was happy in a loving marriage instead of trapped in an elaborate con. I thought about all the other women Marcus might hurt, the investors he'd defrauded, the ripple effects of letting him escape justice just because confronting it was uncomfortable. And I thought about the Elena I used to be before Marcus, the award-winning journalism student who'd broken a major corruption story at her university, who'd believed that truth mattered, that justice mattered, that standing up for what was right mattered even when it was hard. Yes, I said clearly, loudly enough that everyone nearby could hear. I'm being coerced. This man just handed me divorce papers and tried to force me to sign them immediately. He's attempting to flee the country with my money, and I believe he's under federal investigation for securities fraud. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Vivian's sharp intake of breath and Marcus's muttered curse, and then everything happened very fast. Marcus lunged for the divorce papers still clutched in my hand, trying to grab them, to destroy the evidence perhaps, but one of the TSA officers intercepted him, shouting, "Sir, step back," while the other officer called for backup on his radio, his voice urgent and professional as he reported a potential international flight risk. Vivian tried to run, actually turned on her designer heels and bolted toward the terminal exit, but she'd made it maybe 20 feet before 2 more security officers appeared, blocking her path, and her perfectly made-up face crumpled into something desperate and terrified that gave me a savage satisfaction I wasn't entirely proud of but couldn't suppress. More airport security arrived, and then airport police, and suddenly we were being escorted to a private security office, away from the growing crowd of travelers who'd pulled out their phones to record the drama. Because nothing says modern America quite like a public meltdown going viral on TikTok. In the windowless security office that smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, I sat in a plastic chair and watched as Marcus and Vivian were separated, placed in different corners under guard, and within 15 minutes, David arrived with 3 FBI agents, flashing badges and looking grimly professional in their dark suits and serious expressions. "Elena," David said, pulling me into a brief hug before stepping back to maintain his professional demeanor. "I'm glad you're okay. I need you to tell these agents everything. When you first noticed irregularities, what Marcus said to you today, anything that might help with the investigation." So I told them everything, my voice surprisingly steady, about how Marcus had become secretive over the past 6 months, working late nights and taking calls in other rooms, how he'd suggested I take my name off our joint business account because it would be cleaner for taxes, how Vivian had suddenly become interested in spending time with me again after years of growing distant, probably to keep tabs on what I knew or suspected. I told them about the divorce papers, the rushed timeline, the lies about the Maldives when their boarding passes clearly said Belize, and I watched as Marcus's face went from angry to resigned to calculatingly blank, the expression of a man already planning his legal defense. One of the FBI agents, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Rivera, sat across from me and said gently, "Mrs. Castellano, I need to inform you that your husband has been under investigation for insider trading and securities fraud for the past 8 months. We believe he's embezzled approximately $12 million from investors in his tech company, including substantial funds from your joint accounts that originated from your inheritance. We've been building our case, but his attempt to flee the country today has accelerated our timeline. $12 million. The number was so absurd I almost laughed because I'd thought maybe he'd taken a few $100,000, my inheritance and perhaps some company funds, but $12 million was a different magnitude of crime entirely. The kind that made national news and destroyed lives, and sent people to federal prison for decades. What happens now? I asked, though part of me already knew, had seen enough crime dramas and investigative reports to understand the basic trajectory of federal prosecution. Agent Rivera exchanged glances with her colleagues and then said, "Your husband and Ms. Chun will be arrested and formally charged with multiple federal crimes. Because they attempted to flee the country, they'll be denied bail and held in federal detention until trial. The prosecution will probably take 8 to 12 months. In the meantime, All of your joint assets will be frozen pending the investigation, which means you'll have limited access to funds, though we can work with you to ensure you have enough for basic living expenses. The reality of what she was saying sank in slowly, like cold water seeping through fabric. I wouldn't just be losing my husband and my former best friend. I'd be losing my home, my financial security, probably my dignity, as every detail of my private life was dragged through federal court and splashed across newspapers. I'd be the wife who didn't know, the foolish woman who trusted the wrong man. And even though I was the victim, I knew how society would judge me, would question how I could have been so blind, so stupid, so naive. But looking across the room at Marcus, who was now being read his Miranda rights, his hands being cuffed behind his back, I felt something shift inside me, some fundamental understanding that this pain, this humiliation, this devastating betrayal was also somehow a gift, because it had revealed the truth before I'd wasted another 7 years on a lie. As they led Marcus and Vivian away, Marcus turned back to look at me one last time, and for a moment I saw something that might have been regret or might have been rage. I couldn't tell and realized I didn't care anymore. Vivian was crying, mascara running down her cheeks in black rivers, her designer outfit rumpled, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered, and I felt nothing for her, not pity, not satisfaction. Just a vast emptiness where my friendship had once lived. Agent Rivera touched my arm gently and said, "You did the right thing. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you potentially saved other investors from losing their savings, and you ensured these people will face justice." That took courage. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and as I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave the airport security office, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk about Marcus. This is bigger than you know. Meet me at the address below tomorrow at 2 p.m. Come alone. A friend." The message included an address in Manhattan's financial district, and every instinct I had screamed that this was dangerous, potentially stupid. Definitely not something I should do without telling David or the FBI. But curiosity had always been my greatest weakness and my greatest strength, and I found myself screenshotting the address and deleting the message before anyone could see it. Some part of me knowing that my revenge, my real revenge, was only just beginning. The Manhattan office building on Water Street was one of those sleek glass towers that reflected the clouds, making it seem insubstantial, almost illusory. And as I stood on the sidewalk at 1:55 p.m. the next day, I questioned for the 100th time whether walking into an unknown meeting requested by an anonymous texter was the stupidest decision I'd made in a lifetime that had recently been filled with spectacularly stupid decisions. I told David I was meeting with an attorney about the divorce proceedings, which was technically not a lie since I did have an appointment with a lawyer scheduled for later that afternoon, but the omission felt heavy, dangerous, like I was stepping off a cliff and hoping I could fly instead of fall. The lobby was all marble and mirrors, imposing in its corporate sterility, and the security guard barely glanced at me when I said I was visiting Thompson and Associates on the 43rd floor, which either meant it was a legitimate business or an elaborate trap, and I honestly wasn't sure which outcome I was hoping for anymore. The elevator ride up felt endless, my reflection multiplying in the polished metal doors, and I looked tired. I realized dark circles under my eyes that concealer couldn't quite hide, my usually vibrant features drawn and pale. The face of a woman who'd spent the previous night lying awake in her brother's guest room, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the husband she'd loved with the criminal she'd never known. The 43rd floor opened into an understated reception area where a professional-looking woman in her 50s sat behind a desk, her expression neutral but not unfriendly, and she said without preamble, "Miss Castellano? Mr. Thompson is expecting you. Conference room 2 through that door and to your left." I followed her directions, my heels clicking on the hardwood floors, my heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and something else, something that felt dangerously like excitement. The old investigative thrill I'd thought I'd lost forever when I'd given up journalism to become Mrs. Marcus Castellano. The conference room was expansive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering stunning views of the East River, and sitting at the long table was a man in his early 60s with steel-gray hair, expensive suit, and the kind of face that suggested he knew where all the bodies were buried, probably because he'd helped bury some of them himself. "Ms. Castellano," he said, standing and extending his hand with the practiced charm of someone who'd spent decades negotiating high-stakes deals. "Thank you for coming. I'm James Thompson, and I represent certain interests that have been significantly damaged by your husband's criminal activities. I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the way his eyes assessed me with clinical precision, and said carefully, "You're an investor in Marcus's company." He smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes, and gestured for me to sit. "Not exactly. I represent a consortium of investors who've lost a combined total of $47 million thanks to your husband's Ponzi scheme. Which, yes, it turns out is significantly larger than the FBI currently realizes." The number hit me like a physical blow. $47 million meant Marcus wasn't just a criminal, he was a monster, had ruined dozens or hundreds of lives, destroyed retirements and college funds and dreams, and I'd been sleeping next to him, cooking his meals, laughing at his jokes, completely oblivious to the devastation he was causing. Thompson opened a leather portfolio and slid several documents across the table toward me. Official-looking papers with legal headers and dense paragraphs of text that would take hours to properly review, and he said, "Here's what we know that the FBI doesn't yet. Marcus has been running a sophisticated cryptocurrency scheme for the past 3 years, using his tech company as a front. The $12 million they've traced is pocket change compared to what he's actually stolen, and most of it is hidden in digital wallets and offshore accounts that can't be easily frozen or recovered." I stared at the documents, my mind reeling, and asked, "Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me?" Thompson leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture that probably intimidated most people he negotiated with, and said, "Because you, Mrs. Castellano, are in a unique position to help us recover those funds. You were Marcus's wife, you had access to his computers, his files, his personal space. The FBI's investigation will take years and might never recover the full amount, but if someone who knew Marcus intimately, who understood his patterns and passwords and hiding places, were to assist us, we could potentially trace and recover the stolen funds much more quickly." Understanding dawned slowly, and with it came a creeping sense of danger, because what he was suggesting sounded dangerously close to obstruction of justice or tampering with a federal investigation, and I said carefully, "You want me to help you investigate Marcus privately, outside the FBI's case?" He smiled again, and this time there was genuine approval in his expression, like a teacher pleased with a student who'd grasped a complex concept, and said, "I want to hire you, Miss Castellano. We've done our research. You were an exceptional investigative journalist before your marriage, won awards for your work exposing corruption at Columbia. You have skills that are valuable, and you have motivation because Marcus also stole your inheritance, your time, your trust. Work with us to trace and document Marcus's hidden assets, and we'll ensure you receive a substantial finder's fee, 10% of whatever we recover, which could amount to several $1 million, enough to rebuild your life and then some." The offer was tempting, seductively so, because I was facing financial ruin when Marcus's and my assets were liquidated to pay his victims, and the idea of turning my betrayal into profit, of using my pain as motivation to destroy the man who destroyed me, had a poetic justice that appealed to my wounded ego. But I wasn't stupid, and I knew that men like James Thompson didn't make generous offers without expecting significant returns, which meant there had to be risks I wasn't seeing, complications that could blow back on me in ways I couldn't yet anticipate. "What if I find evidence that should be turned over to the FBI?" I asked, watching his face carefully for any tell. "What if Marcus's crimes extend beyond theft, into areas that could endanger people?" Thompson's expression didn't change, remaining professionally pleasant, and he said, "Any evidence of serious criminal activity beyond financial fraud would of course be reported to appropriate authorities. We're not asking you to obstruct justice, Ms. Castellano, merely to pursue a parallel investigation that might be more efficient than the federal bureaucracy. Everything you find would ultimately be provided to law enforcement, just perhaps through our attorneys rather than directly, and after we've had the opportunity to recover our clients' assets." It sounded reasonable, almost ethical, except that I'd been a journalist long enough to know that the gap between technically legal and actually right was often where people like me ended up destroyed, our reputations shredded, our freedom compromised, our good intentions twisted into something corrupt and shameful. But I also knew that sitting in my brother's guest room, crying over a marriage that had never been real, waiting for federal prosecutors to maybe, eventually, possibly recover some fraction of what Marcus had stolen, wasn't going to give me the closure I needed or the justice I craved. "I need to think about it," I said, standing up, and Thompson stood as well, handing me a business card that was probably untraceable to any legitimate business, the kind of card important people gave to other important people when they wanted to maintain plausible deniability. Of course, he said smoothly. Take 48 hours. But Castellano, understand that time is critical. Every day that passes, Marcus or his associates could be moving money, destroying evidence, covering tracks. Your husband may be in federal custody, but he had partners, people who are still free and still motivated to hide their crimes. The elevator ride down felt different than the ride up, heavier somehow, weighted with decisions I hadn't yet made but could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. And when I stepped out into the afternoon sunlight of Lower Manhattan, I pulled out my phone and called the one person besides David who I could maybe trust with this decision, my former journalism professor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, who'd taught me that the truth mattered more than comfort, but that martyrdom was just ego dressed up as principle. Elena, Dr. Martinez answered on the second ring, her warm voice immediately soothing some of my anxiety. I heard about Marcus, saw it on the news. How are you holding up, sweetheart? We met an hour later at a small Italian restaurant near NYU where we used to have lunch during my senior year, back when my biggest worry was whether my investigative piece on university financial aid fraud would be ready for publication deadline. And as I sat across from Dr. Martinez, watch her age-spotted hands wrap around a cappuccino cup, I felt something inside me settle, like coming home after years of being lost. I told her everything, the airport confrontation, the FBI investigation, Thompson's offer, the terrible temptation to say yes because anger was easier than grief and revenge was simpler than healing. Dear. Martinez listened without interrupting, her dark eyes sharp and assessing behind wire-rimmed glasses, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts with the careful precision that had made her such an exceptional teacher and mentor. The question isn't whether you should help Thompson recover stolen assets, she said finally, stirring her cappuccino slowly. The question is whether you're doing this for justice or for revenge, because those two things might look similar but they lead to very different places. Justice means ensuring Marcus faces appropriate legal consequences, and his victims are made as whole as possible. Revenge means destroying Marcus in whatever way causes him the most pain, regardless of collateral damage or ethical boundaries. One of those paths leads toward healing, Elena. The other leads toward becoming something you'll eventually hate. Her words struck deep, cutting through the anger and pain to the truth I'd been avoiding, which was that I wanted Marcus to suffer, wanted him to experience even a fraction of the devastation he'd caused me, wanted him to lose everything the way I'd lost everything, and that desire was human, understandable, maybe even justified, but it was also dangerous because revenge had a way of consuming the people who pursued it, turning victims into villains and pain into poison. But what if I can do both? I asked, hearing the pleading in my own voice, the desperation to believe I could have my cake and eat it too. What if I help Thompson recover the money, which genuinely helps Marcus's victims, and in the process I also get to see Marcus's empire completely dismantled, which happens to also be personally satisfying. Dear. Martinez smiled sadly, the expression of someone who'd lived long enough to watch idealistic students compromise themselves in small increments until they woke up one day and didn't recognize who they'd become. And she said, because men like Thompson don't care about Marcus's victims, Elena. They care about recovering their clients' money, which might overlap with justice but isn't the same thing. And the moment your interests diverge from his, the moment you find evidence that should go to the FBI but Thompson wants to use for leverage, you'll be faced with a choice that could cost you everything, your integrity, your freedom, possibly your safety. Is revenge worth that price? I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that I could navigate those moral complexities, that my journalism training had prepared me to walk ethical tightropes, but sitting there in that familiar restaurant with my trusted mentor, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. The truth was that I was wounded, traumatized, operating from a place of pain rather than principle, and making major decisions about my future while in that state was probably as stupid as making major decisions while drunk or grieving. Another form of compromised judgment that would lead to regrets I couldn't undo. What should I do? I asked, and I sounded young again, vulnerable like the 21-year-old student I'd been a decade ago, before Marcus, before Betrayal, when the world still seemed like a place where good things happened to people who tried their best. Dear. Martinez reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman in her 70s, and said, "Tell the FBI everything Thompson told you. Let them know about the larger scheme, the hidden cryptocurrency accounts, whatever details he shared. Give them Thompson's card and his offer, and let federal investigators decide how to proceed. Then work with the FBI officially if they want your help, but set boundaries. You're a consultant, not an agent, and you get to walk away whenever the emotional cost becomes too high. Focus on rebuilding your life, Elena. Get a good therapist, lean on people who actually love you, and trust that justice will happen even if it doesn't happen on your preferred timeline or in your preferred way." It was good advice, sensible advice, the kind of wisdom that comes from decades of watching people make mistakes and learning from their wreckage, and I knew I should take it. Should walk away from Thompson's offer, and let the professionals handle Marcus's prosecution. But as I hugged Dr. Martinez goodbye and walked back toward the subway that would take me to my brother's apartment in Queens, I found myself thinking about Vivian, about how she'd stood at that airport gate with Marcus's arm around her, smirking at my pain, secure in her victory, and I thought about all the time she'd sat in my kitchen, drinking my wine, eating my food, pretending to be my friend while plotting my destruction. And I thought about Marcus, about how he was probably sitting in federal detention right now, already working with lawyers to minimize his sentence, to negotiate a plea deal, to find some way to emerge from this disaster with some fragment of his freedom and dignity intact, while I was homeless, essentially penniless, publicly humiliated, and expected to just accept it all with grace and maturity because revenge was beneath me or dangerous or morally compromising. Fuck that. I pulled out Thompson's card and sent a text. "I'm in. When do we start?" The response came within minutes. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., same location. Bring your laptop and any documents or information you have about Marcus's business dealings. Welcome to the team." I should have felt guilty, should have been plagued by doubt and ethical anxiety, but instead I felt energized for the first time in years. Like I was reclaiming some essential part of myself that I'd abandoned when I'd agreed to be Marcus's supportive wife instead of Elena Castellano, award-winning journalist and woman who didn't take shit from anyone. That evening, back in David's guest room, I opened my laptop and started compiling everything I knew about Marcus's business. Old emails I'd saved, text messages I hadn't deleted, photos of documents I'd taken when I was helping him with bookkeeping in the early days of his company, before he'd suddenly decided I shouldn't be involved in financial matters anymore. There was more than I'd realized, digital breadcrumbs of a trail I'd been unconsciously following, and as I organized files and created timelines, I felt my journalist brain kick into gear, making connections, seeing patterns, asking questions that demanded answers. One email in particular caught my attention from 3 years ago, right around when Thompson said Marcus's cryptocurrency scheme had started. It was from Vivian, though she'd been using a different email address than her usual one, something generic and untraceable, and the message was short. V. Says the Tokyo connection is confirmed. Wire transfer protocols established. Phase 2 can proceed. At the time, I'd thought it was some business communication that had been accidentally sent to our personal account. Hadn't thought much of it because Marcus was always dealing with international investors and complicated financial arrangements that I didn't fully understand. But now, reading it with new eyes, I saw it differently. V. was probably Vincent Zhao, Marcus's former college roommate and current CTO, which meant he was involved in the scheme too, and the Tokyo connection suggested international money laundering, cryptocurrency exchanges operating in jurisdictions with less regulatory oversight. Exactly the kind of sophisticated financial crime that the FBI might not fully understand yet. I screenshotted the email and several others like it, creating a separate encrypted folder that I backed up to 3 different cloud services, because if I was going to do this, if I was going to pursue Marcus and help Thompson recover stolen assets, I needed to protect myself, needed evidence that I'd been gathering information about crimes rather than participating in them. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was investigating my husband to prove he was a criminal while simultaneously working outside official channels in ways that could make me look like an accomplice, and the line between those two things was much thinner than I wanted to admit. At 2 a.m., unable to sleep, I did what I probably should have done months or years ago. I started searching social media, public records, corporate filings, anything I could find about Marcus and Vivian and Vincent, looking for the truth hiding in plain sight. What I found was disturbing in its banality, because there they all were, living their lives, posting photos of vacations and dinner parties and work achievements, performing happiness and success for an audience of hundreds or thousands, and none of it was real. It was all just performance, just another con. Vivian's Instagram was particularly galling, full of inspirational quotes about female empowerment and authentic living, photos of her doing yoga on beaches and attending charity galas, the persona of a successful, ethical, socially conscious entrepreneur that was completely at odds with the woman who'd helped steal millions of dollars from investors who trusted her boyfriend's tech company. Her most recent post, from 2 days before the airport confrontation, showed her and Marcus at what looked like a fancy restaurant, his hand on her knee under the table. The caption reading, "Sometimes the best things in life are the ones you have to fight for, blessed second chances, true love." And the sheer audacity of it, the way she'd broadcast their affair while I was at home thinking my marriage was solid, made me want to smash my laptop against the wall. But I didn't. Because anger wasn't useful unless it was channeled into something productive, and I was learning to weaponize my rage, to let it fuel me instead of consume me. And as the sun started to rise over Queens, painting David's guest room in shades of pink and gold, I realized that I wasn't the same Elena who'd stood in that airport terminal 2 days ago, broken and betrayed and lost. I was becoming something harder, sharper, more dangerous, and maybe that was exactly what I needed to be to survive this, to transform victimhood into agency and pain into power. And if that meant compromising some of the idealistic principles I'd held dear when the world seemed simpler, then maybe that was the price of growing up, of learning that sometimes justice required getting your hands dirty and revenge could be a form of self-defense, a way of saying to the universe that you refused to be destroyed by people who'd underestimated you. At 9 a.m. sharp, I walked back into Thompson's office building, but this time I felt different, more purposeful, carrying my laptop bag like armor, and wearing the black suit I used to wear when interviewing hostile sources, the uniform of someone who meant business. Thompson was waiting with 2 other people, a woman in her 40s with short red hair who introduced herself as Michelle Park, forensic accountant, and a younger man, maybe 30, named Derek something, who apparently specialized in cryptocurrency tracing and blockchain analysis. MS. Castellano, Thompson said, gesturing to the conference table that was now covered with monitors, printouts, and what looked like enough computing power to hack a small country. Let me be direct about what we're doing here. My clients have hired us to locate and document Marcus's hidden assets using whatever legal means necessary. You'll work primarily with Michelle and Derek, providing insight into Marcus's behavior patterns, passwords he might use, places he might hide information. Everything we find will be documented and eventually turned over to authorities, but our priority is asset recovery for our clients. Are we clear? I nodded, setting down my laptop and pulling out the encrypted drive where I'd compiled my research, and said, I found some emails that suggest Marcus was working with his CTO Vincent Zhao, and that there might be international components to the money laundering, possibly through Tokyo cryptocurrency exchanges. I've also compiled a list of Marcus's common passwords, his mother's maiden name, significant dates he uses for security questions, that sort of thing. Michelle's eyes lit up with professional interest, and she immediately plugged my drive into one of the computers, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she opened files and started cross-referencing information, and she muttered, "Holy shit. This is good. This is really good. Look at this email chain, they're definitely running money through Japanese and Korean exchanges, probably using anonymous digital wallets to obscure the trail." Derek leaned over her shoulder, his expression intense with concentration, and said, "If we can identify the wallet addresses they're using, we can trace every transaction on the blockchain. It's public information, just not easily attributable to specific people without insider knowledge." Mrs. Castellano, did Marcus ever mention anything about Bitcoin, Ethereum, any specific cryptocurrencies? I thought back through 7 years of marriage, thousands of conversations, trying to remember details I hadn't paid attention to at the time because I trusted Marcus completely, because I believed his reassurances that the technical details of his business were too boring and complicated for me to worry about, and suddenly I remembered something. He had a notebook, I said slowly, the memory surfacing like something from underwater. A small black moleskine that he kept in his desk drawer at home, and he was always very protective of it, said it was where he brainstormed product ideas and company strategy. But one time I saw him writing in it and the page had what looked like random letters and numbers, strings of characters that didn't look like words or even normal notes. At the time I thought maybe it was code for software development, but now, Derek and Michelle exchanged glances and Derek said urgently, "That could be wallet addresses, recovery phrases, private keys. If we could get access to that notebook, we might be able to unlock millions in cryptocurrency." Thompson leaned forward, his expression calculating, and asked, "Where is this notebook now?" "Still at your house." I shook my head, feeling frustration rise, and explained, "The FBI has sealed our brownstone as part of the investigation. I can't access it without their permission, and even if I could, Marcus would have hidden anything incriminating before he tried to flee the country." But even as I said it, I was thinking about the brownstone, about 7 years of living there, of knowing every corner and hiding place, and suddenly I remembered something else, something I'd completely forgotten until this moment. "Wait," I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling through photos, looking for something specific. Last year, Marcus renovated his home office, had custom shelving built in. He said it was just for aesthetics, but the contractor mentioned something about a hidden safe being installed behind one of the bookshelves, and Marcus got weirdly angry, told the guy to never mention it again to anyone, including me. At the time, I thought he was just being paranoid about home security, but what if that's where he kept important documents, including that notebook? Thompson's expression sharpened with interest that was almost predatory, and he said, "Can you get back into your house?" I thought about it, running through possibilities, and said slowly, "I still have keys, and technically I'm the co-owner of the property, so I have legal right to access it. The FBI has inventoried everything and taken what they needed for their investigation, but they haven't actually barred me from entering. They just asked me to notify them before removing any items. If I went there to collect personal belongings, clothes and photos and things that are legitimately mine, they couldn't really object, and while I was there, if I happened to notice something that might be evidence." Thompson smiled, but it was the smile of a shark that had just scented blood in the water, and he said, "That's exactly the kind of creative problem-solving we need. Michelle, prepare a detailed list of what to look for. Document everything with photos, but don't remove anything that would be obviously evidence until we've consulted with our attorneys about the legal implications." Castellano, when can you access the property? I pulled up my calendar on my phone, then called Agent Rivera, the FBI investigator who'd interviewed me at the airport, and told her I needed to collect some personal items from my house, asked if there was a time that would be convenient. She sounded distracted but not suspicious, told me that the property was no longer under active investigation, so I was free to come and go as needed, just to please document anything I removed in case it became relevant to the case later. It was almost too easy, which made me nervous because in my experience, when things seemed too easy, it usually meant you were missing something important, walking into a trap you couldn't see until it closed around you. That afternoon, I stood on the front steps of the Park Slope brownstone that had been my home for 5 years, the place where I'd thought I was building a life with someone who loved me, and now it felt foreign, hostile, like a crime scene in a movie, which I supposed it was. The key turned smoothly in the lock, the door swinging open to reveal the familiar hallway with its vintage wallpaper and hardwood floors, but everything felt different, contaminated by knowledge, and I had to force myself to walk inside, to breathe normally, to not run screaming from this place where I'd been happy based on lies. Marcus's office was on the 2nd floor, a converted bedroom with built-in bookshelves and a large mahogany desk that he'd inherited from his grandfather, and as I climbed the stairs, I was acutely aware of Michelle and Derek waiting outside in a rental car, monitoring my progress via a small camera pinned to my jacket, recording everything I saw so they could analyze it later. The office looked exactly as Marcus had left it, laptop gone, presumably taken by the FBI, but papers still scattered across the desk, books lined up on shelves, a coffee mug with dried residue sitting on a coaster. The mundane details of a life interrupted mid-stride. I moved to the bookshelves, running my hands along the spines, looking for anything unusual, any indication of which section might hide the safe the contractor had mentioned, and after several minutes I found it. One shelf that felt slightly different when I pressed on it, mounted just a bit more solidly than the others, and when I pushed on the right side it clicked and swung open, revealing a wall safe with a digital keypad. My heart pounded as I pulled out my phone, reviewing the list of possible combinations I'd compiled, significant dates, numerical patterns Marcus favored, variations on passwords I'd seen him use, and I started trying them one by one, each failed attempt making me more anxious that the safe might lock after too many wrong entries. Birthday combinations didn't work, neither did our anniversary or his mother's birthday, And I was about to give up when I tried one more combination, one I hadn't wanted to think about, the date Marcus and Vivian had first met. According to her Facebook timeline, which I'd memorized in my late-night stalking session, the safe clicked open. Inside was exactly what Derek and Michelle had hoped for. The black moleskine notebook, several passports in different names with Marcus's photo, multiple credit cards, and a stack of papers that looked like account statements for offshore banks in Belize, the Cayman Islands, and Switzerland. I photographed everything methodically, my hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system, and I was so focused on documenting the safe's contents that I almost missed the sound of a car door slamming outside. Footsteps on the front walk, a key turning in the front door lock. Someone else was entering the house. I froze, listening to heavy footsteps moving through the first floor, and through my jacket camera's audio feed, I heard Derek whisper urgently, "Elena, get out of there. Someone's coming upstairs." But it was too late. The footsteps were already on the stairs, moving purposefully toward the office, and I quickly closed the safe, trying to swing the bookshelf back into place, but it stuck, wouldn't quite click shut. And then the office door opened and Vincent Zhao walked in, Marcus's CTO and apparent partner in crime, and his expression of shock quickly transformed into something much more dangerous. "Elena," he said, his voice carefully neutral, but I could see his mind working behind his eyes, calculating, assessing what I was doing here, what I might have found. "What are you doing in Marcus's office?" I tried to appear calm, casual, like I hadn't just been breaking into a hidden safe and photographing evidence of international financial crimes, and I said, "I came to get some of my things. This is my house too, Vincent. What are you doing here?" He moved further into the room, positioning himself between me and the door, and I realized with a sick clarity that Vincent wasn't just Marcus's business partner. He was potentially dangerous, was probably here to do exactly what I'd been doing, collecting or destroying evidence before the FBI investigation could uncover everything. "Marcus asked me to pick up some files for his lawyers," Vincent said, but his eyes kept darting to the bookshelf, to the safe that was slightly ajar, and I knew he'd seen it, knew that I'd seen it, and we were both pretending everything was normal while tension coiled between us like a living thing. Through my jacket camera I heard Derek say, "Michelle's calling 911. Stall him." But stalling someone who might be willing to hurt me to protect millions of dollars was easier said than done, and I found myself backing up, putting Marcus's desk between Vincent and myself, my mind racing through options and finding them all inadequate because I wasn't a fighter, wasn't trained in self-defense, was just a woman alone in a house with a man who had very good reasons to want me silenced. "The FBI has already been through this office," I said, trying to sound confident, authoritative, like I wasn't terrified. "Whatever you're looking for, they've probably already taken it." Vincent smiled, and it was not a nice smile, and he said, "Actually, I don't think they have. Marcus was very careful about that safe, very particular about who knew about it. But you found it, didn't you, Elena? You always were smarter than Marcus gave you credit for." He moved around the desk toward me, and I grabbed the coffee mug, the only weapon-like object within reach, holding it up like it might actually be useful, and said loudly, clearly, for the camera and microphone, "Vincent Zhao is threatening me in my own home. I want this recorded." Something flickered in Vincent's expression, surprise, maybe respect, definitely recalculation, and he stopped advancing, his hands raised in a gesture of false peace. "I'm not threatening you," he said, but his voice said otherwise, held an edge that made my skin crawl. "I'm just surprised to see you here. Marcus said you probably avoid this place, said you were too emotional to deal with being here alone." The casual cruelty of it, the implication that Marcus had discussed my emotional state with his criminal partner, made anger flare through my fear, and I found myself saying, "Marcus said a lot of things that turned out to be lies. Did he tell you he was planning to leave you holding the bag for the fraud charges while he and Vivian ran off to Belize with all the money? Because that's what the FBI thinks happened, that you were the fall guy, the one who'd take the blame while Marcus disappeared." I was making it up, improvising based on nothing but instinct and old journalist tricks about playing suspects against each other. But I saw Vincent's expression change, saw doubt creep in, and I pressed the advantage. "They found emails," I continued, my voice gaining confidence even though my hands were shaking. "Communications between Marcus and Vivian about framing you for the cryptocurrency scheme. About making sure all the evidence pointed to you as the mastermind while Marcus just looked like a naive CEO who trusted the wrong CTO. You really think Marcus was loyal to you? He threw me away after 7 years of marriage like I was garbage. What makes you think you were any different? Vincent's face had gone pale and I could see him processing, wondering if it might be true, if Marcus had betrayed him too, and in that moment of uncertainty, I heard sirens in the distance getting closer and Derek's voice in my ear saying, "Police are 2 minutes out. Keep him talking." Marcus kept detailed records. I lied, hoping Vincent couldn't tell. Everything about the scheme, including your role, all documented in case he needed leverage. It's all in that safe, Vincent, and the FBI is going to find it, and you're going to spend 20 years in federal prison because you trusted the wrong person. The sirens were getting louder, almost here, and Vincent's expression shifted from threatening to desperate, and he lunged toward the bookshelf, toward the safe, probably planning to grab whatever he could and run, but I'd been expecting it. Had tensed in preparation, and I swung the coffee mug with all my strength, connecting with his shoulder, not enough to seriously hurt him but enough to throw off his balance, and he stumbled, cursing. The office door burst open and 2 NYPD officers entered with guns drawn, shouting commands, and Vincent raised his hands, his face a mask of fury and resignation, and it was over just like that. The confrontation that could have ended with me seriously hurt instead ending with Vincent in handcuffs, and me giving a statement to police officers who kept telling me how lucky I was, how dangerous it had been to confront a potential felon alone in an isolated location. Agent Rivera arrived 20 minutes later, her expression thunderous, and she pulled me aside, away from the officers and the crime scene techs who were now photographing everything, and she said quietly, intensely, "What the hell were you thinking? Elena, Vincent Zhao is suspected of money laundering, fraud, and now we're looking at possible witness intimidation or worse. You could have been killed." I knew I should feel chastened, apologetic, but instead I felt exhilarated, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, like I'd reclaimed some essential part of myself that marriage to Marcus had slowly eroded. "I found evidence," I said, pointing to the still open safe. Multiple passports, the notebook Derek and Michelle had mentioned, offshore account statements. It's all there. Rivera looked at the safe, then back at me, her expression complicated, mixing professional approval with personal concern, and she said, "We'll need you to make a formal statement about everything you found and everything that happened with Vincent. But Elena, listen to me. I know you want justice, I know you want to feel like you're contributing to Marcus's prosecution, but you cannot keep putting yourself in danger like this. Let us do our jobs. You're a victim, not an investigator." But I wasn't just a victim anymore, hadn't been since I'd stood in that airport terminal and decided to fight back instead of crumble, and as I followed Agent Rivera downstairs to give my statement, I was already thinking about what came next. About the notebook full of cryptocurrency wallet addresses, about how Marcus's carefully constructed empire was crumbling piece by piece, and how deeply, savagely satisfying it felt to be the one holding the hammer. That supported fraud victims and women escaping financial abuse, wanting the money to do some good beyond just cushioning my own landing. And I started writing again, really writing, not just articles about my personal drama but investigations into financial crime, cryptocurrency regulation, the ways that digital currency had created new opportunities for sophisticated criminals to operate beyond traditional legal frameworks. One afternoon, 3 months after Marcus's arrest, I received a call from an unknown number, and when I answered, I heard Vivian's voice, thin and shaky in a way I'd never heard before, because Vivian had always been composed, confident, unshakable. "Elena," she said, and there was a long pause filled with what sounded like muffled crying. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand that, but I need you to know something. I need you to understand." Every instinct told me to hang up, to not give her the satisfaction of my attention, but curiosity won out, the same curiosity that had made me a good journalist, that had led me to investigate Marcus despite the risks, and I said coldly, "You have 2 minutes." She took a shuddering breath and said, "I didn't plan it. The affair with Marcus, it just happened, and by the time I realized how wrong it was, how much I was hurting you, I was already in too deep. He told me you two were essentially separated emotionally, that your marriage was a formality you were both maintaining out of habit rather than love. I know now that was a lie, that he told me what I wanted to hear so I'd help him, but at the time I believed him. The audacity of it, the attempt to reframe her betrayal as something that had happened to her rather than something she'd actively chosen, made anger flare hot and bright in my chest, and I said, "You were my friend, Vivian. My maid of honor. You stood at my wedding and promised to support our marriage, and then you destroyed it. You don't get to play victim now just because Marcus also lied to you." There was silence on the line, then Vivian said quietly, "You're right. I know you're right. But Elena, I'm in federal prison, facing 15 years for money laundering and fraud, and Marcus is getting a reduced sentence because he's cooperating against everyone, including me. He's painting me as the mastermind, as the person who recruited him into crime, which is complete bullshit, but his lawyers are making it sound credible. I'm going to spend the best years of my life in prison while Marcus serves maybe 5 years in minimum security, and I just needed you to know that he destroyed both of us, that we're both his victims in different ways." Part of me recognized the truth in what she was saying. Marcus had indeed manipulated both of us, had lied to both of us, had used our different forms of love for him to advance his criminal goals. But the larger part of me rejected the equivalent she was trying to create, because I'd been a victim of deception while Vivian had been a willing participant in fraud, and those were fundamentally different moral positions. "We're not the same, Vivian," I said firmly. "You chose to help Marcus commit crimes. You chose to steal millions of dollars from innocent investors. You chose to sleep with my husband and mock me at the airport while you two ran off to your tropical paradise. I made mistakes by not seeing what Marcus really was, but I didn't choose any of this. You did. So no, I don't forgive you, and no, we're not both victims in the same way, and I hope your 15 years in prison gives you time to understand the difference." I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and rage and something else, something that felt almost like grief because a part of me still remembered the Vivian I'd loved. My college roommate who'd stayed up all night helping me study for exams, who'd held my hair when I was sick, who'd seemed like a sister I'd chosen rather than been born with, and mourning the death of that friendship felt like mourning a death, even though the friend I was grieving had never really existed, had always been someone capable of breathtaking cruelty hiding behind a mask of affection. "Dear." Martinez invited me to lunch a few days later, and over pasta at our usual restaurant, she studied me with her sharp, assessing gaze and said, "You look different. Harder in some ways, but also more solid, more certain. How are you really doing, Elena?" I thought about the question, really considered it instead of offering the reflexive "I'm fine" that was expected in casual conversations, and said slowly, "I think I'm discovering that I'm someone who can survive things I didn't think I could survive. I'm angrier than I used to be, more cynical about people's motivations, less willing to give the benefit of the doubt. But I'm also writing again, doing work that matters, using my skills to expose corruption instead of supporting someone else's dreams. So maybe I'm not doing well in the traditional sense, but I'm doing real, and that feels more important than comfortable." Dr. Martinez smiled, the expression warm and sad and proud all at once, and said, "That's growth, sweetheart. Painful growth, the kind that comes from trauma rather than gentle life lessons, but growth nonetheless. Just be careful not to let your anger calcify into bitterness, not to let Marcus's betrayal convince you that everyone is untrustworthy, or that intimacy is always dangerous. The world still has good people in it, Elena. You're one of them." Her words stayed with me over the following weeks as I continued writing, investigating, building a new life from the pieces of my shattered old one, and slowly, carefully, I started letting people back in, accepting dinner invitations from old journalism school friends, reconnecting with my family beyond just David, even going on a few awkward coffee dates that reminded me I was still capable of attraction, still interested in connection, even if I was also more guarded, more careful about who I trusted with access to my heart. The break in Marcus's case came 5 months after his arrest, when Vincent Zhao, facing his own lengthy prison sentence, decided to cooperate with prosecutors and revealed something that changed everything. Marcus hadn't kept his documentary records as insurance against the Russians. He'd been planning to sell them. He approached several journalists and rival criminal organizations. Vincent testified in a pre-trial deposition I was allowed to read. He was shopping the information, trying to auction it to whoever would pay the most, either to publish it as an exposé or to use it as leverage against the Russian operation. He saw his arrest as a minor setback, assumed he'd make bail or escape somehow, and planned to use the records as his retirement fund, his way of disappearing permanently with enough money to live comfortably forever. The revelation was shocking even by the standards of Marcus's already extensive betrayal, because it meant he'd been willing to endanger everyone: me, Vivian, Vincent, the investors he'd defrauded, even his Russian criminal partners, all for the chance to make more money and secure his escape. It was sociopathy on a scale I'd struggled to fully comprehend even after everything I'd learned, and when Agent Rivera showed me the communications Marcus had sent to potential buyers of his information, using encrypted messaging apps and anonymous accounts, I felt a strange sort of finality, like this was the last piece of evidence I needed to fully accept that the man I'd married had never existed, had always been a performance concealing someone fundamentally broken, incapable of genuine love or loyalty, or any emotion that wasn't in service to his own interests. "We found the records," Agent Rivera told me, her expression triumphant. Marcus had them stored in 3 different locations: a safe deposit box in the Cayman Islands, an encrypted cloud server, and hidden in the source code of his company's software, embedded in a way that looked like normal programming, but was actually documentation of every illegal transaction he'd ever processed. It's the most comprehensive evidence of international money laundering we've seen in years, and it's going to bring down not just Marcus, but at least 30 other people involved in the operation. The trial, when it finally happened, was anticlimactic in the way that real-life justice often is. Not the dramatic courtroom confrontations of movies, but rather a slow, bureaucratic process of evidence presentation, expert testimony, and legal maneuvering that stretched over 6 weeks. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery and watching Marcus in his expensive suit, conferring with his lawyers, occasionally glancing back at me with an expression I couldn't read: regret, maybe, or resentment, or possibly just calculation about whether I might still be useful to him somehow. On the day I testified, I wore my black suit again, the armor I'd learned to use against a world that judged women's credibility partly based on how they looked, and I spoke clearly, factually about our marriage, about Marcus's deceptions, about the evidence I'd helped uncover. Marcus's defense attorney tried to paint me as a scorned woman motivated by revenge rather than justice, suggested that I'd manufactured or exaggerated evidence because I was angry about the affair with Vivian. But Agent Rivera's testimony about the validity of the information I'd provided, combined with the documentary evidence that corroborated everything I'd said, made those attacks ineffective. Transparent attempts to discredit a witness whose credibility was actually quite solid. When the jury returned after 2 days of deliberation, I was sitting between David and Dr. Martinez, and I held their hands, so tightly I probably left bruises as the foreperson read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: securities fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, wire fraud, each charge another year or decade added to Marcus's sentence. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd spent 40 years on the bench seeing every variation of human corruption, sentenced Marcus to 25 years in federal prison, Vivian to 17 years, Vincent to 12, and when she explained her reasoning, she said something that struck me as profound in its simplicity. "You, Mr. Castellano, destroyed lives with your greed. You stole from people who trusted you, you corrupted people who loved you, and you showed no remorse until facing consequences made cooperation advantageous. You are precisely the kind of criminal our financial system's regulations exist to stop, and your sentence reflects the magnitude of the harm you caused." 25 years. Marcus would be 62 when he was released, assuming he served his full sentence, and while part of me thought it wasn't enough, could never be enough to compensate for the destruction he'd caused, another part recognized that justice wasn't really about equivalence or revenge, it was about accountability, about saying clearly that certain behaviors were unacceptable and carried consequences, about trying to deter future Marcus Castellanos from thinking they were clever enough to get away with it. Outside the courthouse, I gave a brief statement to the assembled media, keeping it simple and honest. I'm grateful that justice was served today, that Marcus and his co-conspirators will be held accountable for the lives they destroyed. I hope the victims of his fraud can find some measure of closure, though I know that financial recovery can never fully restore what was lost. And I hope my story serves as a reminder that even when powerful people betray us, even when systems fail to protect us, we still have agency. We can still fight back, and justice, though slow and imperfect, can still prevail. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but I'd said everything I needed to say, and I walked away from that courthouse with David and Dur. Martinez flanking me like bodyguards, protecting me from the crush of attention, and I felt something shift inside me, some heavy weight I'd been carrying finally releasing because it was over. The investigation and trial and constant anxiety about whether Marcus would face consequences, and now I could finally, actually begin the work of healing instead of just surviving. You gave me permission to be angry instead of just sad, to demand justice instead of just accepting loss, and that gift is immeasurable. Her words stayed with me, reminding me why I'd chosen visibility over privacy, why I'd been willing to endure public scrutiny and criticism to tell my story honestly, because silence protected perpetrators while exposure protected future victims. And if my pain could spare even one person from similar trauma, then the discomfort of public disclosure was worth it. 2 years after Marcus's sentencing, Agent Rivera called with unexpected news. The Russian criminal organization that Marcus was laundering money for has been taken down. It was a massive international operation involving law enforcement agencies from 12 countries, and it resulted in over 60 arrests, including some very high-level figures in organized crime. Your information, the records you helped us locate, was critical to making those cases. The news felt surreal, like discovering that my personal trauma had accidentally contributed to something much larger than my individual justice, and I felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. Because part of me had thought that Marcus facing consequences would feel more definitively healing, would create some clear before and after divide where I was damaged before and whole after, but instead healing had been gradual, incremental, a slow accumulation of better days and therapeutic insights and moments of unexpected joy that built toward something that resembled normalcy, but would never be quite the same as innocence. I'd started dating someone finally 3 years after the airport confrontation, a documentary filmmaker named Michael who I'd met while researching a story, who knew my history and seemed remarkably unbothered by it, who had his own scars and trauma from a previous relationship, and understood that broken people could still love each other without needing to be fixed first. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to trust completely again, I told him on our 5th date, wanting to be honest about my limitations, my damage, the ways Marcus had fundamentally altered my relationship with vulnerability and intimacy. Michael had smiled, sad but accepting, and said, "I'm not sure anyone should trust completely. Trust isn't about blind faith. It's about continuous choice, about deciding every day to believe in someone's good intentions while remaining aware that people are complicated and flawed and capable of disappointing us. You're not damaged beyond repair, Elena. You're just more realistic about what relationships are, which might actually make you better at them than people who still believe in fairy tales." It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. This relationship built on mutual understanding of human fallibility rather than idealistic notions of perfect love, but it felt real in a way my marriage to Marcus never had. Felt like something I was choosing consciously rather than falling into accidentally, and that consciousness, that deliberate selection of partnership despite its risks and uncertainties, felt like a form of courage I hadn't known I possessed. Dear Martinez and I still had lunch quarterly, and at our most recent meeting she'd studied me across the table and said, "You look happy." Not the performative happiness people show on social media, but the real thing, the kind that comes from doing work you believe in and building relationships based on honesty and becoming someone you can respect. "I'm proud of you, Elena. Surviving trauma is one thing, but thriving after it, refusing to let it define you entirely, that's something else." I'd thought about her words for days afterward, turning them over in my mind like stones, and I'd realized she was right. I was happy, or at least I was building toward happiness, creating a life that felt authentically mine instead of a reflection of someone else's expectations or manipulations. I was writing stories that mattered, exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable. I was in a relationship that felt mutual and honest, built on clear communication rather than romantic fantasy. I was financially secure, professionally respected, surrounded by people who knew my worst moments and chose to love me anyway. It wasn't the life I'd imagined when I'd married Marcus 8 years ago, wasn't the fairy tale ending I'd thought I was building, but it was real and solid and mine, and those qualities mattered more than any fantasy. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly, 3.5 years after Marcus's sentencing, when Vincent Zhao was released early for good behavior and full cooperation with federal investigations, and he requested a meeting with me through our mutual attorneys. I debated refusing. I had no desire to see Vincent, to be reminded of the airport confrontation that had nearly turned violent, to give him an opportunity to justify or explain his role in Marcus's crimes. But curiosity won again, that dangerous, persistent curiosity that had driven so many of my choices, and I agreed to meet him in a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Brooklyn, with my attorney present as witness and protection. Vincent looked different than I remembered, thinner and grayer despite being only in his mid-30s, with a kind of exhaustion that suggested prison had been hard on him in ways that weren't immediately visible. And when he sat down across from me, his first words were, "I owe you an apology and an explanation, though I'm not sure either will mean anything after what happened." I waited, saying nothing, letting him fill the silence, and after a moment he continued, "Marcus recruited me into his schemes gradually. It started with small things, technical workarounds for regulatory requirements, creative accounting that wasn't quite illegal but pushed boundaries, and he had this way of making it seem exciting, rebellious, like we were clever innovators rather than criminals. By the time I understood the scope of what we were doing, I was already implicated, already facing potential charges if I tried to back out, and Marcus made it very clear that if I betrayed him, he'd make sure I took the fall for everything while he walked away clean. It was similar to what Vivian had said, this narrative of gradual corruption, of being manipulated into complicity by someone who specialized in reading people's weaknesses and exploiting them, and part of me recognized the truth in it while another part remained skeptical, because at some point Vincent had made choices, had decided that money and loyalty to Marcus mattered more than ethics or law or the people they were hurting. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice flat, unemotional. "What do you want from me, Vincent?" He looked down at his hands, which were clenched on the table, and said quietly, "I want you to know that when I confronted you in that office, I wasn't planning to hurt you. I was desperate, terrified that the Russians would kill me if I didn't find Marcus's records. But I wasn't going to physically harm you. I know that doesn't change how frightening it was, doesn't erase the fact that I threatened you, but I need you to know I'm not a violent person, just a weak one who made terrible choices and hurt innocent people in the process." I studied him, this man who'd been Marcus's best friend and co-conspirator, who'd helped steal millions of dollars, who'd faced me in that brownstone office with what had certainly felt like potential for violence. And I realized that I didn't care about his intentions or his self-image or his need for my understanding. "Vincent," I said clearly, "I'm glad you served your time. I'm glad you cooperated with the FBI and helped take down the people you were working with. But I don't forgive you and I don't absolve you, and I don't want to be part of your redemption narrative. You made choices that harmed hundreds of people, that destroyed lives and savings and retirements, and whatever Marcus's role in manipulating you, you were an adult with agency and you chose crime over integrity. So thank you for the apology, but I don't accept it, and I don't want to hear from you again." I stood up, my attorney following my lead, and Vincent looked up at me with something like respect mixed with sadness, and he said, "You're right. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But for what it's worth, I am sorry, and I am trying to be a better person now than I was then, and I hope someday you can believe that people are capable of change, even people who've done terrible things." I didn't respond, just walked out of that coffee shop and into the bright afternoon sunlight, and I realized that Vincent had given me something valuable even if he didn't know it. Confirmation that I didn't need to forgive to heal, didn't need to understand or empathize with the people who'd hurt me to move forward with my life. That healing and forgiveness were separate things and I could have one without the other. That night, I sat in my apartment with Michael, talking about the meeting with Vincent, processing my feelings with someone who listened without judgment or unsolicited advice. And at some point the conversation shifted from past trauma to future possibilities, and Michael asked gently, "Do you think you'll ever want to get married again? Have kids, build a traditional family, do the whole domestic partnership thing?" It was a question I'd been avoiding thinking about seriously, because the idea of marriage felt contaminated by my experience with Marcus, felt like a trap I'd narrowly escaped rather than an institution worth participating in. But sitting there with Michael, feeling safe and seen and genuinely cared for, I found myself saying, maybe. Not the way I did it before, not with blind trust and romantic idealization and the fantasy that love conquers all complications. But maybe with clear communication and realistic expectations, and the understanding that marriage is a choice you keep making every day, rather than a promise that guarantees a future. If I did it again, it would be different, less romantic, more pragmatic, built on friendship and mutual respect rather than passion and fairy tale narratives. Michael nodded thoughtfully and said, "That sounds like a healthier foundation than most people have when they get married." Most people are operating on cultural scripts and romantic mythology, rather than clear-eyed assessment of compatibility and values. You've earned your cynicism, Elena. But I hope you don't let it stop you from building the life you actually want rather than just avoiding the life that hurt you. His words echoed in my mind over the following weeks, challenging me to think about what I wanted proactively rather than reactively, to define my future by aspirations rather than fears, and slowly, carefully, I started imagining possibilities. Maybe marriage to someone I trusted as deeply as was realistic. Maybe children if my biological clock hadn't run out. Maybe a life that included vulnerability and commitment without naivety or denial. 5 years after the airport confrontation, the FBI closed its investigation into Marcus's criminal organization, having successfully prosecuted everyone involved and recovered over $300 million of stolen funds, which were being distributed to victims through a complex restitution process that would take years to fully complete. Agent Rivera sent me a formal letter thanking me for my cooperation and noting that my courage in coming forward had been instrumental in bringing dozens of criminals to justice, and while the language was bureaucratic and official, I could hear genuine warmth beneath the formal phrasing, the acknowledgement that I'd done something difficult and important. The story of my involvement in Marcus's prosecution had become something of a legend in criminal justice circles, used as a case study in how civilian cooperation with law enforcement could enhance investigations, and I'd been invited to speak at FBI training sessions and law school classes about financial crime investigation. It was strange and sometimes uncomfortable being held up as some kind of hero when I mostly felt like someone who'd stumbled through trauma and made the best choices I could with incomplete information and overwhelming emotions. But I showed up and told my truth and hoped it helped future investigators do their jobs more effectively. Marcus remained in prison, serving his 25-year sentence at a federal facility in Pennsylvania, and according to Agent Rivera's occasional updates, he'd become a model prisoner, teaching financial literacy classes to other inmates, helping them understand credit and budgeting and the legal ways to build wealth, which was either redemptive or deeply ironic depending on your perspective. Part of me wanted to believe he was genuinely reformed, was using his skills for good now instead of exploitation, but the larger, more realistic part of me recognized that people like Marcus, charismatic manipulators who built careers on reading what others wanted to see and performing accordingly, were exactly the type to excel at performing rehabilitation while maintaining their core selfishness and lack of genuine empathy. I never visited him in prison, never responded to the occasional letters he sent through my attorney, choosing instead to let that relationship remain firmly in the past where it belonged, a chapter that was finished and didn't require an epilogue or reconciliation to have meaning. Some relationships don't get closure, don't get neat resolutions where everyone achieves understanding and forgiveness and peace, they just end. And the people involved have to find ways to integrate the loss into their ongoing lives without the satisfaction of definitive conclusions. Vivian wrote me once from her own federal prison, a shorter letter than Marcus's, less self-justifying, mostly just expressing regret and acknowledging that she destroyed our friendship for reasons that seemed important at the time but now felt hollow and stupid, and she hoped I was happy, hoped I'd built a good life from the wreckage she'd helped create. I didn't respond to her either. Not because I hated her but because I simply had nothing to say, no interest in maintaining any connection to someone who'd betrayed me so fundamentally, and silence felt more honest than forced civility or performative forgiveness. On the 5th anniversary of the day Marcus had handed me divorce papers in the airport, I woke up and realized I'd forgotten the date, hadn't marked it consciously as an anniversary of trauma, and that forgetting felt significant, like evidence that the event no longer defined my daily consciousness, had been integrated into my personal history without remaining an open wound that required constant attention. I went about my normal day, writing an article about cryptocurrency regulation, having lunch with a source for an upcoming investigative piece, attending therapy with Dr. Chun where we discussed my relationship with Michael and whether I was ready to move in together, meeting David for dinner where he told me he was dating someone seriously and thinking about proposing, experiencing the mundane pleasures and complications of a life that was mine, that I'd built intentionally, that wasn't defined by trauma even though trauma was part of my story. That evening, Michael asked me to move in with him officially, not as a temporary arrangement but as a genuine merging of lives, and I said yes without the terror I'd expected to feel, without the voice in my head screaming that commitment was dangerous and trust was foolish, and anyone I let close would eventually destroy me. I said yes because I wanted to, because the relationship felt solid and honest and worth the risk, because I'd learned that avoiding pain wasn't the same as living well, and choosing safety over connection would make me smaller rather than stronger. We were sitting on his apartment balcony overlooking Prospect Park, the late evening sun painting everything golden, and Michael said, "I love you, Elena. Not despite your history or because of your history, just because of who you are. The person who survived terrible betrayal and chose to keep being brave and honest and open instead of hardening into bitterness and cynicism. You could have let Marcus destroy your capacity for trust, your ability to believe in people, but you didn't, and that resilience is remarkable." I thought about his words, about whether they were true, whether I'd really maintained my capacity for trust, or whether I'd just developed more sophisticated protective mechanisms, better at assessing risk, more careful about who I let pass my defenses. And I realized it didn't matter which interpretation was correct because both versions, resilient survivor and cautiously optimistic realist, were improvements over who I'd been when I stood in that airport terminal 5 years ago. Broken and bewildered and certain my life was end. "I love you too," I said, and it felt different than when I'd said those words to Marcus, felt more grounded, more real, less like a leap of faith and more like a considered choice I was making with clear eyes and full knowledge of the risks. And I'm terrified, which I think is healthy, because I never want to be so naive again that I miss obvious signs that someone is lying to me. But I also don't want to be so damaged that I can't recognize when someone is genuinely being honest and kind and worthy of trust. So yes, let's move in together. Let's build something real. And if I'm occasionally paranoid or need reassurance or struggle with triggers from my past, thank you in advance for being patient with that. Michael smiled and pulled me close, and we sat there watching the sun set over Brooklyn, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hopeful about the future, excited about possibilities instead of just surviving present circumstances, and I realized that this was what healing actually looked like, not some dramatic transformation where all pain disappeared and scars vanished, but rather a gradual process of integrating trauma into a larger life story, where it was one chapter among many rather than the defining narrative of everything that came after. 6 months later, I received a call from Thompson's office. They'd tracked down the final hidden accounts from Marcus's criminal operation, recovering an additional $18 million that no one had even known was missing. Money Marcus had squirreled away in such obscure jurisdictions, and under such complex corporate structures that it had taken years of forensic accounting to locate. My finder's fee from this final recovery was $1.8 million, bringing my total compensation for helping dismantle Marcus's empire to over $6 million, and the money felt surreal, like winning a lottery I'd never wanted to enter. Compensation for trauma that no amount of money could actually heal, but that somehow made rebuilding my life significantly easier. I used a substantial portion to establish a foundation, the Elena Castellano Fund for Financial Crime Victims, that provided legal assistance, financial counseling, and mental health support for people who'd been defrauded by white-collar criminals, because I'd learned firsthand how inadequate the support systems were for fraud victims, how society treated financial crime as somehow less serious than violent crime, even though the devastation it caused could be equally traumatic, could destroy retirements and marriages and mental health and trust in institutions that were supposed to protect vulnerable people. The Foundation's first year helped 47 individuals and families navigate the aftermath of financial fraud, and reading their stories, hearing their experiences, I was struck by how similar they all were: the shame, the self-blame, the way victims internalize responsibility for crimes committed against them, the way society questioned what they'd done wrong instead of focusing on what criminals had done wrong. It reinforced my conviction that telling my story publicly, refusing to hide or be ashamed, had been the right choice, because visibility and honesty were the antidotes to the isolation and stigma that fraud victims experienced. Dr. Martinez attended the Foundation's launch event, and afterward she pulled me aside and said, "Your mother would be so proud of you. She taught you integrity and courage, and you're honoring her memory by using what you learned from your trauma to help other people. That's the best kind of legacy, Elena. Turning pain into purpose." I thought about my mother often, about how I wished she'd lived long enough to see me survive and eventually thrive after Marcus's betrayal, how I wished I could ask her advice about Michael and moving in together, and whether I was ready to trust someone with that kind of commitment again. But in her absence, I tried to channel what I imagined she would say, that love was always a risk but isolation was a guarantee of emptiness, That being hurt didn't make me broken, but refusing to try again might. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but rather doing difficult things despite fear, because they mattered more than comfort. 7 years after the airport confrontation, Michael and I got married in a small ceremony at City Hall with just David, Dr. Martinez, Agent Rivera, and a few close friends as witnesses. It wasn't the elaborate wedding I'd had with Marcus, no white dress or hundreds of guests or fantasy of fairy tale romance. Just two people making pragmatic promises to support each other with realistic expectations and clear communication. We wrote our own vows, and mine included the line, "I promise to trust you while remaining aware that trust is a choice I make every day, not a guarantee against future pain," which Michael later joked was possibly the least romantic wedding vow in history, but also the most honest. Our honeymoon was a working trip, actually. We traveled to Tokyo to research an article I was writing about international cryptocurrency regulation and a documentary Michael was filming about financial crime in the digital age. And we spent our days interviewing regulators and reformed hackers and our nights exploring the city, eating incredible food, talking about our hopes and fears and the life we wanted to build together. It felt perfect in its imperfection, felt real in a way that performative romance never had, and I thought about how different this partnership was from my marriage to Marcus, how Michael knew all my damage and trauma and still chose me. Not despite those things but including them, accepting that I came with baggage but believing I was worth the complexity. 8 years after Marcus's sentencing, Agent Rivera called with news that I'd been half expecting, half dreading. Marcus is filing for early release. He's served 8 years of his 25-year sentence, and he's claiming rehabilitation, citing his work teaching financial literacy to other prisoners and his cooperation with ongoing investigations. The parole board will hold a hearing in 3 months, and victims have the right to submit impact statements or appear in person to argue against his release. The news hit me harder than I'd anticipated, stirring up emotions I thought I'd processed and integrated, because the idea of Marcus walking free after only 8 years when he destroyed so many lives felt like a violation of justice, like the system was failing to hold him accountable for the full magnitude of his crimes. But I also knew that anger at parole decisions was common among victims, that the criminal justice system was designed to balance punishment with rehabilitation, and that my personal desire for Marcus to suffer indefinitely wasn't necessarily the same as what justice actually required. I spent 2 weeks agonizing over whether to submit an impact statement, discussing it endlessly with Michael and Chan and Dr. Martinez, trying to determine whether inserting myself back into Marcus's legal proceedings would be healing or re-traumatizing, whether I had an obligation to speak for other victims who didn't have my platform and resources, whether my voice would even matter to a parole board that had probably already made its decision based on bureaucratic criteria rather than emotional testimony. In the end, I decided to write a statement but not appear in person, wanting to exercise my right to be heard without subjecting myself to seeing Marcus again, to hearing his voice or watching him perform remorse or feeling the complicated tangle of old emotions that direct confrontation would inevitably trigger. My statement was 5 pages long, detailing not just what Marcus had done to me personally but the broader impact of his crimes, the investors who'd lost life savings, the employees who'd lost jobs when his company collapsed, the ripple effects of financial fraud that destroyed trust in legitimate businesses and made it harder for honest entrepreneurs to raise capital. I wrote about how 8 years seemed like a long time but wasn't really proportional to the magnitude of harm he'd caused, how early release after serving only a third of his sentence sent a message that white-collar crime wasn't taken seriously, that wealthy, educated criminals could charm their way to leniency, while less sophisticated criminals served full sentences for less damaging crimes. And I wrote about my own ongoing recovery, the fact that 8 years later I was still in therapy, still dealing with trust issues and hypervigilance, and the ways his betrayal had fundamentally altered my relationship with intimacy and vulnerability, and that while I'd built a good life, the trauma he'd caused hadn't magically disappeared just because time had passed. The parole board denied Marcus's request for early release, citing the severity of his crimes and the insufficient time served relative to the harm caused, and when Agent Rivera called to tell me the decision, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and emptiness, because Marcus remaining in prison didn't undo what he'd done, didn't restore what had been lost, didn't heal my wounds. It just meant that accountability had been maintained, that the system had worked at least this once, and that felt important even if it didn't feel cathartic or conclusive. 10 years after the airport confrontation, Michael and I had a daughter, Clara, named after my mother, and holding her in the hospital, looking at her tiny perfect face, I felt terror and joy in equal measure. Terror that I was responsible for protecting this vulnerable human from all the harm the world contained. Joy that I'd been brave enough to create new life despite knowing intimately how much pain existence could bring. Being a parent transformed my relationship with my own trauma, made me acutely aware of how my unhealed wounds could potentially damage her, motivated me to do the continued therapeutic work of processing and integrating my past, so it didn't leak toxically into her present. Dear Sean and I spent months working through my fears about parenting, about whether I could trust my own judgment after being so catastrophically wrong about Marcus, about whether my hypervigilance would make me an anxious, overprotective mother who couldn't let Clara take normal risks and develop autonomy. You're not the same person who married Marcus, Dr. Chan reminded me repeatedly. You've done years of work to understand what happened, why you miss warning signs, how to recognize red flags in the future. That self-awareness actually makes you better equipped than most parents, who've never had to examine their own vulnerabilities and limitations so carefully. Watching Clara grow, teaching her to walk and talk and eventually to think critically and ask questions and trust her instincts, became another form of healing. A way of rewriting the narrative from woman who was betrayed, to mother who teaches her daughter to be strong and discerning and brave. I told her age-appropriate versions of my story as she got older, not to burden her with my trauma but to normalize talking about difficult things, to model resilience and the fact that bad things happening didn't mean you were broken forever. My investigative journalism career flourished over those years, and I became known as someone who specialized in financial crime and corporate fraud, someone who could explain complex white-collar crimes to general audiences in ways that made them accessible and compelling. I won awards, published a book about my experience and the broader landscape of financial fraud in America, appeared regularly on news programs as an expert commentator, and while the professional success was gratifying, what mattered more was the impact, the policies that changed because of my reporting, the criminals who faced accountability because of my investigations, the victims who found their voices because I'd modeled speaking publicly about fraud and betrayal without shame. 15 years after Marcus handed me those divorce papers, I received a letter from him, not requesting anything, not asking for forgiveness or understanding, just informing me that he'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer and had perhaps a year to live, and he wanted me to know that his final months would be spent trying to make whatever amends were still possible, that he'd been working with a victim's advocate to identify people harmed by his crimes, and find ways to provide meaningful restitution beyond the court-ordered financial payments. The letter was matter-of-fact, unsentimental, and it left me with complicated feelings I spent weeks processing with Dr. Chan. Part of me felt a savage satisfaction that Marcus would die in prison, that he wouldn't get the chance to rebuild his life after serving his sentence, that his remaining time would be spent suffering as he'd made so many others suffer. But another part, the part that had done 15 years of therapeutic work and built a life based on something other than revenge, felt mostly sadness that a human being who'd once had potential for good had destroyed himself through greed and selfishness, sadness that so much pain and destruction had stemmed from one person's moral failures, sadness that death was coming for him as it came for everyone, regardless of whether they'd lived well or poorly. I didn't visit him. I didn't respond to the letter. But I did donate to the hospice facility where he was receiving end-of-life care, anonymously, because I'd learned that my healing didn't depend on his suffering, that punishing him further wouldn't restore what he'd taken, and that compassion for someone who'd harmed me didn't mean forgiving him or minimizing his crimes. It just meant recognizing his humanity, even while condemning his actions. Marcus died 6 months later, and his obituary was a strange document that mentioned his tech company's early success, his criminal conviction, and his prison education work, but struggled to integrate those contradictory elements into a coherent narrative. Because how do you summarize a life that contained both innovation and exploitation, both genuine achievement and devastating corruption? I read it once, felt a complicated wash of emotions I didn't try to categorize or understand completely, and then I closed the browser and went to pick up Clara from school, returning to the present moment and the life I'd built, which was full and meaningful and mine. 20 years after the airport confrontation, I stood in the terminal at JFK, coincidentally the same terminal, though a different gate, waiting to board a flight to a journalism conference where I'd be receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award for my investigative work on financial crime. Clara was with me, now 10 years old, smart and curious, and already showing signs of having inherited both her grandmother's integrity and her mother's investigative instincts. Michael was taking a later flight, coming straight from finishing a documentary about cryptocurrency regulation that would premiere at Sundance next month. As we waited at the gate, I found myself thinking about that day 20 years ago when my world had exploded, when Marcus had handed me those papers and I thought my life was ending, and I marveled at how impossibly far I'd traveled from that moment, how much I'd survived and learned and become. If I could go back and tell that devastated woman what the next 2 decades would hold, the investigation and trial, the public exposure and media attention, the foundation I'd build and the lives I'd impact, the love I'd find with Michael and the daughter we'd create together, the career I'd reclaim and exceed beyond anything I'd imagined, I'm not sure she would have believed me. Because the distance between those 2 versions of myself was so vast it seemed almost like different people entirely. "Mom," Clara said, tugging on my sleeve and pulling me from my reverie. "You're doing that thing again where you stare into space and look sad but also not sad. What are you thinking about?" I smiled and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head, and said, "I'm thinking about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us end up being the things that push us toward becoming who we're supposed to be. I'm thinking about how grateful I am for the life we have, even though it came from surviving something really painful. And I'm thinking about how proud I am of you, and how much I love our family, and how even when bad things happen we have choices about what we do next. About whether we let those things destroy us, or whether we use them as fuel to build something better." Clara considered this seriously the way she considered most things and then said, "Because of what your first husband did, right? The one you don't talk about much, but that made you become an investigative journalist and help people." I nodded, always honest with her but appropriate to her age and understanding. "Yeah, he hurt me really badly, and for a while I thought that pain would define my whole life. But it turned out to be just one chapter, and I got to write all the chapters that came after, and they've been pretty wonderful." Our flight was called, and as we boarded, I took one last look at the gate area where Marcus had ambushed me 2 decades ago, and I felt nothing, no residual pain, no anger, no longing for the life I'd thought I was building with him, just a kind of distant curiosity about who that younger Elena had been and compassion for what she'd endured and pride in how she'd survived and ultimately thrived. The plane lifted off, carrying us toward whatever came next, and I held Clara's hand and thought about the strange mathematics of trauma and recovery, how something that had felt apocalyptic in the moment had eventually become just one story among many in a life that contained multitudes. Marcus had tried to break me, had thought he was clever enough to steal my money and betray my trust and walk away unscathed, but he'd failed to account for the one thing that mattered most, that I was stronger than he'd imagined, more resilient than he'd calculated, more capable of transformation than he'd ever been. 20 years later, Marcus was dead and largely forgotten except as a footnote in articles about financial fraud and a cautionary tale in my speeches about white-collar crime. But I was alive, thriving, surrounded by people who loved me authentically, doing work that mattered, raising a daughter who would inherit not my trauma but my resilience, not my wounds but my wisdom, not my pain but my power. And that, I realized, was the ultimate revenge, not destroying the person who'd harmed me, but building such a magnificent life from the wreckage of what they'd destroyed that their betrayal became merely the catalyst for something far greater than what they'd taken. Justice had been served through the courts, but vindication came through living well, through refusing to let Marcus's worst actions define my story, through becoming someone even more remarkable than the woman he'd tried to diminish. The airport where my marriage had ended had become just another airport, unremarkable and unmemorable. The divorce papers that had felt like a death sentence had become just old documents in a lawyer's file, irrelevant to who I'd become. And the man who'd thought he